You are listening to the Primary PE podcast brought to you by Wesport. Hello and welcome to the first ever Primary PE podcast brought to you by Wesport. My name is Ian, and not only do I have the honour of lending my Bristolian twang to this podcast, but I also work for Wesport as an ex-PE specialist and primary school teacher to help improve the PE provision within primary schools. But that's enough about me. Let's talk about the podcast instead. Each month we're going to have a focused area which we will discuss and help find ways to improve our PE provision without, of course, increasing our workloads. Based on this area, we'll have an expert guest come in to help provide us with a deeper understanding, as well as providing practical ideas which can impact the children within our schools. We'll also dedicate some time to highlight events and opportunities, both locally and nationally, which you or your schools may wish to sign up for. And then finally, we'll have the PE confessional, a chance to anonymously confess our PE mishaps and know that you are not alone in having those days where everything simply goes wrong. And now that the introductions are out the way, we can move on to today's focus, which for this episode is physical literacy. Put simply, physical literacy is the outcome of high quality PE sessions within school, where children become confident, competent and healthy movers. And if done correctly, sets children up to be physically active and healthy throughout their lives. Now there are questions and debates within this subject area, including actually around the meaning and definition that I've just given you. But we are very fortunate today to have an expert within the field who can provide clarity and guidance on the topic within a primary school setting. Dr Liz Durden-Myers is a senior lecturer in PE at Gloucestershire and Bath Spa University. Her PE expertise is within PE development, sports psychology and of course physical literacy, which was the area of focus for her doctorate thesis. If you would like any further information around what's about to be discussed, the links to the sites and papers are within the description of this podcast, or alternatively, you're welcome to contact Wesport directly via our website or Twitter pages. And now that I've had the opportunity to shamelessly plug Wesport website and Twitter, we can go straight into the interview with Dr Durden-Myers, which was recorded on the week of the 14th of February 2022. Good afternoon, Liz, and thank you for joining us for our first ever Wesport Primary PE podcast.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to sharing my passion today, which is around physical literacy with yourself and your listeners.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this all week because I'm a PE nerd, and hopefully the people listening have been looking forward to it as well. First question was research by Edwards and Bryant in 2019 suggests that an issue with physical literacy is with it being widely misinterpreted with many definitions, something which you allude to in your thesis. I mean, how much of a barrier has this been, and is there a widely accepted definition of what physical literacy is that you can share with us today?
Yeah, you're spot on. If you go to Google and Google physical literacy, you'll be faced with multiple definitions from multiple countries worldwide, and it can be quite a daunting and difficult space to try and understand. But yes, there are multiple definitions globally, and while there are some that are accurate, there may be some others that are not necessarily the best way to describe physical literacy. So commonly, physical literacy is misinterpreted as being the ABCs of movement or just fundamental movement skills. But the best place to go to find out more about physical literacy is to go to the International Physical Literacy Association, the IPLA, and they have the accurate definition, and they define physical literacy as the motivation, confidence, physical competence, and knowledge and understanding to value and take responsibility for engagement in physical activity for life. Whilst that's quite a mouthful, and I get that all the time around that's a very long definition, it provides the means to the end. So it highlights how those four elements, motivation, confidence, physical competence and knowledge and understanding, are key in promoting physical activity for life. Similarly, physical literacy is also commonly mistaken as only important for primary schools or just for children. And instead it is a life course concept that is both applicable within and beyond education. But ultimately, physical literacy as a concept aims to promote engagement in physical activity for all and for life.
Is that then a universal definition? Because when I was doing research around the subject, I'll look at Canadian research or Canadian documents, and then you look at American documents, and then you look at it, British ones, and they all had different definitions. Is it different to is the definitions different to your region, or is it that some of those regions just have a more widespread misconception of what the term is?
It's interesting, and I think for many countries there are different explanations. But for example, the Canadian consensus statement started off from IPLA definition, and then they, in their operationalising of physical literacy in their context, they put their Canadian stamp on it by tweaking some elements. So some have gone through that process where they've looked, why the IPLA is credible in their definition is because of Margaret Whitehead, who is the founder of the concept, who is the president of the IPLA. So it's definitely coming from the original source. And so many definitions are tying into that original source. But then there's other definitions that may have got onto that FMS or ABC's misinterpretation, and then it's kind of spread from there, that misinformation and misinterpretation.
And then you suggest that the main aim of physical literacy is to promote sustained engagement in physical activity throughout life. So why is it so important, and how does physical literacy create people who are physically active throughout their entire lives?
Yeah, so sustained engagement in physical activity throughout life is so important for many, many reasons. But for example, for the health and well-being benefits, both physical and psychological, for happiness and for flourishing and in enabling everyone to be able to thrive. But physical literacy specifically is a guiding and foundational concept that can improve engagement in physical activity by providing more holistic, inclusive and meaningful approaches to physical activity promotion. That's what guides the physical literacy. So whereas other initiatives previously might have just focused on the physical skills or just knowledge and understanding, physical literacy aims to have that holistic picture, physical skills, motivation, confidence and knowledge and understanding, and making sure that it's inclusive for all pupils, regardless of their physical endowment, or making sure that it's for everybody, starting with those that are furthest behind, and making sure that it's meaningful by putting the pupil or the child at the centre of the experience.
You said earlier in your previous answer that a misconception is that it's just for children, but it applies for adults. In terms of the physical literacy, is it, even if it's for adults and children, is it more impactful to have it younger, or does it not make much difference what stage you come to it through life?
Yeah, so we often use the kind of analogy that physical literacy is a journey, and so that no matter what stage you are throughout life, you're on this physical literacy journey, and you may have got off to a great start, or you may not have got off to the best start, or you might be coming back to your physical literacy journey after an injury or after a difficult period in your life. We use that notion of a journey, a progressive journey that you can continually improve upon and work towards. But there is no doubt that having a good start in life and developing a range of dispositions towards physical activity, whether that be physical, attitudinal, or knowledge and understanding based, at those early years is really, really important. And when we talk about the plasticity of motor development and making sure that those connections are made before the age of 7, because typically that's when connections then start to decline. The primary schools have got a huge role in ensuring that all pupils get off to a great start.
Focusing on the primary schools and especially on the teachers, you've mentioned previously that there's research that suggests that CPD and training is currently not providing educators with a firm understanding of physical literacy, with most support given, especially for primary school teachers, being based on providing physical resources and programs over often one-day CPD workshops. Why is that a potential problem, and what's the alternative to providing CPD in that way?
Yeah, firstly, I hugely empathise first of all with most primary generalists, because the physical education training they receive and the professional development they receive is often very limited, with most PGCE courses only offering 6 hours of PE training, which obviously then makes PE teaching a very daunting experience. And professional development opportunities are predominantly offered by being decontextualised one-day sport courses, which are not necessarily physical education professional development, which again the research tells us is not necessarily the best way or the best approach to take. So what we would call for is more time in initial teacher education be spent on PE training, as well as more in context and longer duration professional development that supports teachers when teaching their classes within their specific contexts. So often when you come and do CPD away from school, you're in a fantastic sports hall, or you're in a context that doesn't necessarily translate to your local context or your local needs with your pupils in your classroom. So we're definitely calling for much more in context and tailored professional development that is ongoing, so it's an ongoing journey. And once you finish one phase, it very much puts you onto the next one. Where's the next steps for your professional development?
No, I completely empathise. I'm laughing because I can remember my PGC training, and it was 1 week of PE, and then I think it was the Beast from the East happened during that week. So 3 of the 5 days were cancelled. So the PE provision for my PGC was so limited, and it's only by luck that I've got a passion for PE. Otherwise, I would have gone in not very skilled at all, teaching PE to primary school children and being responsible for that. So if physical literacy is embedded well within a primary setting, what would be the key features that you would expect to see in a Key Stage 1 environment and a Key Stage 2 environment?
Yeah, so they're very, very similar sort of guiding principles across the stages, really. And I'm often very encouraged when I go and work with primary teachers, actually, because this is not anything necessarily new. So my first kind of recommendation would be having this a whole child approach and a child-centric approach. So understanding you do it all the time in other subjects. So for example, in numeracy and literacy, you'll be able to tell me exactly where they are in their development, what's their next steps, what's their targets. We need to have that level of concern and interest over their physical development as well, and their physical literacy journey as much as their literacy or numeracy journey. So the first kind of guiding principle is that whole child approach, so making sure that we're developing the physical skills, but their motivation and confidence, and developing that love of being physically active, and starting to implement the knowledge and understanding of why it's important to be active and how they can be more effective when active. So that's the first kind of guiding principle. The second one, which is really, really important, again, is a range of positive and meaningful experiences. So making sure that our curriculum is broad and balanced, or I would argue rich and varied. So we want high quality experiences that are positive in a range of activities. So not just having a dominant sport offer, i.e. invasion games, not just having that dominate the majority of the curriculum, but having a nice range of activities that are relevant to our young children. And then finally, the last guiding principle is this child-centred approach, where we put the pupil at the centre of the experience, and making sure that our lessons are tailored to the learning needs of the pupils in front of us. It's personalised, and we use formative assessment to really guide where we're going next. So how did they cope with that lesson? How did they cope with that learning experience? And what are the implications for my next lesson and the series of lessons thereafter? So really making sure that it's a responsive curriculum. Going back to your point earlier, it's not a scheme of work that's taken off the shelf and done to children. We teach children in response to their needs. So is that the best way to get the most out of those children in that lesson? But similarly, things like play-based learning and fostering a love and enjoyment of being active across the whole school, not just in PE, is really, really important. And I also think, especially with lockdown and post-COVID worlds or continuing COVID worlds, exploration of green spaces, green and blue spaces, is really, really important for health and well-being, and we know that as well. So making sure that you do have an indoor and outdoor PE offer, so making sure we don't always just run into the sports hall, but make sure we do get out and about in the local environment or in our fields as well. So indoor and outdoor offer.
Based on what you've just said, then would you believe then for a primary school that PE would be something that's embedded not as a singular subject that happens in isolation, but it would work best if it was embedded throughout the school life and environment?
Yeah, so definitely, the levels of inactivity are a whole societal problem, and you're not going to solve it by saying, well, yeah, but we do PE one day a week or 2 times a week. It has to be owned by the whole school, and we all value physical activity. throughout the whole school, whether that's teaching staff or support staff or governors, absolutely everyone, parents as well. We'll come on to parents later, but everyone needs to value it because it has to be part of our ethos and culture. And I think probably where we can draw inspiration is with the new national curriculum for Wales, where they've got health and wellbeing as an overarching principle that goes across the school, but also within subject, because we need to make good progress. And the way we can do that is in subject, but it also needs to be an overarching theme across the school. And there's loads of opportunities in other subjects or in other aspects within the day to be active. So learning numeracy and literacy actively, or going and doing bark rubbings outside for art and design, or all those other aspects, or collecting nuts in science or whatever it might be. There's loads of opportunities to be active and have active pedagogies.
Thank you. And you conclude in your thesis that there are 4 different types of barriers to physical literacy within teaching, and those being leadership, institutional barriers, individual barriers, and value barriers. Would you mind explaining what these may look like within a primary setting, and maybe give an example or two of how you might potentially overcome them?
Yeah, so those categories came about by asking primary teachers and secondary teachers what they perceive the barriers to be after having gone through 6 weeks of professional development and having been in consultation with me for over 12 weeks. And these were the things that they found that continued to prevent them from being fully committed or fully embedding physical literacy within their practice. With the leadership barriers, often Ofsted frameworks and government value came up. So, for example, teachers would say to me, yes, physical education and physical activity and physical literacy is important, but that's not necessarily what we get inspected on or measured on by Ofsted. And so there is this relative value coming up all the time. So I do believe in it, but that's not what I'm measured on, or that's not what the focus of the school is on, or that's not what Ofsted value. So that was kind of the leadership level. And then at the institutional level, some would say, again, it's whether the head teacher or the senior leadership team are just enacting what Ofsted and the government want. So again, they're kind of pushing down that expectation around numeracy and literacy, and we can't look wider than that until that's sorted, or the emphasis is on phonics and not on physical education at the moment. And similarly, if there was any sort of funding or time out of the timetable, it would go towards numeracy and literacy, because they could justify that in terms of the spend for cover, but not necessarily justify the spend for physical education. So that was an interesting one, because it was very much school by school, but the head teacher and the SLT were really influential on whether PE flourished or not. And then at the individual level, there was lots that came up from there. It was individual in terms of their teacher confidence and competence to teach a range of activities, not just the one that we've been working on, but how do I then upskill myself in the next activity, in the next seasonal format, or how do I keep building upon my expertise? So there was teacher barriers. There were pupil barriers. They were saying that some are completely disengaged already, and how do I recapture their interest and love of being physically active when they haven't had positive experiences up until this point. And then there was also lots of parental barriers. So we found that in some situations the parents were not necessarily on board, and then they had ramifications around sending them in with kit or appropriate clothes or notes, and children were being off PE for regular amounts of time because of notes, but not necessarily feeling confident in how to address that, and a variety of other areas. But one issue that kind of permeated all areas was this notion of value, and that PE or physical literacy has a relative value. So when we talk about physical literacy in isolation, yes, it's important. Yes, it's important that the children are active, healthy, happy, and thrive. But again, numeracy and literacy, or I need to disrupt PE time in order to do the play or the other things, or catch up on numeracy or phonics or whatever it might be. So there's just always this relative value coming up, and also just making sure that if we are saying physical activity is so important and a precursor to be able to learn effectively, why isn't it communicated that highly in the guiding policy documents, in the national curriculum, in the Ofsted guidance, at school policy level, all those aspects? And then again, why aren't we seeing that in teachers, pupils and parents, why are they not valuing it? Is because the quality of the experience they're getting isn't the best it could be. So yes, there was lots and lots of barriers, but there were also lots and lots of solutions. And so whilst I've painted a little bit of a scary picture, my next question for them were, well, what are the solutions? And they came back with 20 solutions to every problem. So that's why I'm so passionate about teaching, because one thing is that what we are good at is finding solutions to challenges, and where there's a will, there's a way, and we can address these challenges. And there's movement at the Ofsted and governmental level now with a new national plan for sport and recreation. We're trying to get into senior leadership teams more and more to really champion and enable PE leads to be more effective. And we're trying to tackle initial teacher education, upskilling of teachers, and hopefully that will then permeate to the pupil and the parents' perceptions of physical education and informed by physical literacy.
So from what you've just said, it makes it seem like the values barrier is the biggest of those barriers. Is that the case, or is it that they're all equally as potentially equally as problematic as each other?
Yeah, I think equally problematic, but I think that the value is a cross-cutting theme and catalytic. So if we can transform the value, I think we'd make those barriers in each of those levels lesser. So yeah, definitely if we can transform the value of PE, maybe by making it a more of a core subject, or really going back to stipulating how much hours and how and when to use sports premium, and sports coaches, and yes, they do have a role, but making sure that it's carefully considered. But and again, just making sure that we are prioritising physical activity, physical education, physical literacy alongside numeracy and literacy.
Great, thank you. And you'll be pleased to know we're on to the final question. Corbin, all the way back in 2016, mentioned that assessment is a key part of physical literacy for both professionals and parents' understanding of children's development, but also acknowledges the need for a clear understanding of the best way to assess a child's progress. What recommendations would you make for primary schools looking to assess physical literacy in a meaningful way without drastically increasing their workload?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting knife edge, because it has to be feasible ultimately if assessment's to be meaningful. And so my advice would be that whatever assessment methods that you implement need to be feasible, so that you're able to continue doing them throughout the whole of the year with multiple cohorts to know whether your teaching is having an impact. But primarily, I'd be looking for a holistic assessment that looks beyond just the physical development. So physical development, knowledge and understanding, and their motivation and confidence. And you can do that by using acronyms like, head, heart, hands, or if it's know, show and grow, we quite like that. Attitude, skills and knowledge. So that's what we're looking for, is that well-rounded picture of that individual, because they may be able to articulate knowledge and have a great disposition, but their physical skills are not quite there yet, and then but they can still make progress. So and vice versa in all of those. So a holistic assessment, but assessment can't stand alone. It needs to sit alongside effective pedagogies and well-designed curricula. So holistic assessment against a well-designed and sequenced curriculum that is, where appropriate, shared and or conducted with pupils, that is meaningful. So I'm also keen that in the Key Stage 2, we should be having those conversations with pupils. They should be making assessments about their own development and their own targets. Where would they like to go next? Not where I would like to take them next, but where would they like to go next, and how can we get there together? So I think that's really, really empowering, because ultimately we want them to eventually take responsibility for their own engagement, and part of that is them understanding where they are on their own physical literacy journey and how we can support them to be more active or to develop their physical literacy.
Thank you for taking your time out today, Liz, to answer those questions and to go through that. There is one more question, which is a little bit more lighthearted, which I'm not giving you time to prep for, which is something that we'll ask everyone in the future. And the question is, and it is lighthearted, there's a future education secretary has announced that there will only be one sport taught throughout all schools from September. And you've got 20 seconds to pick your sport and defend your choice So which sport would you choose and how would you defend your choice?
Okay, so I'm going to throw a real curveball in there and say that because I'm passionate about meaningful physical education and placing the student at the centre of the learning experience, I would ask the pupils what sport they would like to achieve, and I would then deliver physical, cognitive and effective outcomes within that medium, so through that sport. So ultimately, the sport is irrelevant. I'm teaching children to be more physically active, and the sport is just the vehicle.
That was a great answer to a question I just threw at you.
No worries. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and I'll be more than happy to have follow-up conversations around physical literacy and for more support. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you this afternoon and share that passion around physical literacy. Any questions following this, more than happy to support you and your listeners by answering any follow-up questions.
No, and I really appreciate that, and it's been a pleasure to listen to an expert talk with such passion and knowledge about the subject. So thank you once again for agreeing to participate today.
Thank you.
Thank you once again goes to Dr Durden-Myers for giving up her time to provide such a great introduction to such a fascinating topic. And again, if you want more information on anything we've just discussed, please visit the Wesport Twitter and website pages. Or if you look at the description to this podcast, there are a list of resources, including one from the Association of Physical Education, who provide a great breakdown and support on physical literacy and what it looks like in each of the key stages. We now, though, have come on to the part of the podcast where we share a couple of events and opportunities which are happening both locally and nationally over the next month or so. For a more detailed list of events that are coming up, we have a PE bulletin which we send out on a termly basis. If you want to be added to the mailing list to receive this PE bulletin, please don't hesitate in contacting us. We're going to select 3 from the bulletin in this episode, and the first one is from Real PE, who are a company who provide high quality child-centred CPDs, resources and schemes of work. Now they're holding a free webinar for schools on the 24th of March, and it's schools just within our area, which is a great opportunity to explore if this company can meet the needs for your school. And it's completely free and there's no obligation to purchase anything, so it's a nice way to test the waters to see if this company is suitable for your environment. The second thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the Women's Football Euros, which kicks off this summer, and England are the host country. And with International Women's Day as well, this may be a great time to start raising excitement and interest in the event. There are plenty of resources available for schools, both to promote the event and how to provide more opportunities for a cross-curricular experience. There are links in the podcast description if that's something of interest to you. The final thing that we'd like to highlight is if your school is looking on how to develop whole school approach to improving physical activity, then a physical activity toolkit might be the solution. One such toolkit is Creating Active Schools, which we've called CAS for short, because education loves its acronyms. CAS was developed by a sister organisation in Yorkshire, and this toolkit allows schools to assess how embedded physical activity is across the whole school and provides suggestions for target areas for schools to focus on to develop their physical activity provision. This year we've been supporting 20 schools within South Gloucestershire going through their journey, and in theory it should help provide a very structured and consistent approach to the development of the subject, regardless of things like having a new PE lead or having a PE lead who's not as confident within the subject, or any change of SLT. It should allow for a consistent development within the subject. And again, if that's something that's interesting to you or your school, don't hesitate to contact us. And finally, we enter the primary PE confessional. The PE confessional is your chance to cleanse your teaching souls from any PE mishaps or faux pas you may have had. And let's face it, we have all had them. And if you wish to confess anything, we won't read out your name, but we will reward your honesty by providing a free bag of balls to anyone whose confession we read out. Being our first podcast, we will only do the one confession. I was taking my year 3 class on their weekly swimming lesson and was getting the more experienced children out of the main pool. And as I walked past and looked across to the smaller pool, I could see a small child whose name I won't include sat on the side of the pool instead of being in the change room. I ordered into the change room and told him off for not following instructions. But as I got closer, I realised he was not the child I thought it was, and then to make it worse, he walked into a different changing room, which was being used by another school. So it turns out that not only was the child not who I thought he was, but he belonged to a different school and was actually sat on the side of the pool waiting for his lesson to begin. Rather than owning up to my teaching mistake to the next school, I quickly dived into my changing room with the rest of the children from my school. I can't say we've all been there, but consider your teaching soul cleansed. And that, I'm afraid, brings an end to our first ever podcast. Now, if you have any ideas for what the focus subject should be of the podcast, or if you want to add to the PE confessional, please contact us. And if your suggestion is picked as the main focus, or if your confession is read out, we'll send you a free bag of balls for your school. And for the final time, I'd just like to say that all the information is available on, and you've guessed it, the podcast description, and of course, the Wesport Twitter and website pages. Thank you once again for taking the time to listen to the podcast, and we hope that you join us again next time.